This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on 12th World Trade Organization Ministerial Meeting and Stakes for India. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist.
Today we are discussing the WTO Ministerial Meeting and what is at stake for India. We see that the Union Minister for Commerce and Industry, Mr. Piyush Goyal, led the Indian delegation at the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference in Geneva, Switzerland. And we have seen that some of the issues that have been highlighted by India is food security, the eradication of hunger, and also sustainable fishing and farming. Ambassador Wadhwa, how do you see this ministerial meeting and how do you see the issues that are important for India that have been raised by the Indian delegation there? How do you see them getting a response globally?
At this 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, which is happening now after a gap of almost 5 years, we have some very important issues for India which will be discussed at this conference. Some of these issues have been highlighted, as you mentioned, by Minister Piyush Goyal in his plenary address already. And that includes the WTO's response to the pandemic, the fisheries subsidy negotiations, also the agriculture issues that includes public stockholding for food security. And then, of course, we have interest in WTO reforms and also moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmission, which India wants now not to be extended in the future, given the progress that the country has made over the years and the loss of revenue which is being caused. So I think India has a vital stake in protecting the interests of all stakeholders in India as well as interests of other developing and poor countries. And for this, it has taken the lead on 2 or 3 specific issues which you have touched upon.
Ambassador Wadhwa, we also see the minister there. He spoke on a number of issues and he also said that the rising food prices threaten the survival of millions of people. It subjugates poor nations and people to imperfect markets. And Mr. Goyal also added that the WTO rules should ensure collective moral obligation that no person in the world goes to bed hungry. The debate is that the global hunger, and we have seen of late, one example is, of course, Sri Lanka, right in our neighborhood. And we have seen how food inflation seems to have gotten worse over time. How effective do you think is a mechanism like WTO to deal with these rising food prices globally and the problem that we see of people starving, not having enough food? Whereas if you look at studies, most studies show that the world is producing enough food. So what is this gap which is happening continuously? And do you think the WTO can address this gap?
Yes, I think agriculture is one very important issue. And in the agriculture sector, this month, we've seen that the of WTO has brought 3 draft texts on agriculture and trade and food security and exemption of the World Food Program from export restrictions for negotiations. Now, India has reservations about some of the provisions in the draft decisions and has been engaging in the process of discussions and negotiations in order to be able to preserve the rights under the Agreement on Agriculture without undermining the existing ministerial mandates. So an important issue on the negotiation at the WTO relates to protection of India's food grain procurement program at minimum support prices. Because such programs involve purchase from farmers at administered prices, and therefore they become key to support to farmers and consumers in India. Now, WTO rules currently limit the subsidy that can be provided to such products being procured. So this issue is being negotiated at the WTO by the G33. G33 is a coalition of developing countries, of which India is a key member, and the African group, which have come together along with the ACP group. Now, this is a group of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, etc., in submitting a proposal on permanent solution to the issue of public stockpiling for food security purposes. And this happened on the 31st of May 2022. So the developing countries in the negotiations want some improvements over the ministerial decision which was adopted, if you remember, at the 9th Ministerial Conference of the WTO, which happened in Bali in 2013, where the members had agreed to negotiate a permanent solution on the issue of public stockpiling for food security purposes. And in the interim, it was agreed that until a permanent solution is reached, that the members would exercise restraint Commonly, this is known as the Peace Clause in raising disputes in respect of public stockholding programs for food security purposes, which was instituted before 7th December of 2013, even if these countries exceeded the permissible limits. Now, another issue which is very important is that of additional disciplines on export restrictions of agricultural products. The proponents of export restrictions are seeking an outcome on two issues, basically. One is exemption of foodstuffs purchased from non commercial humanitarian purposes by the World Food Program from the application of export restrictions. And second is the advanced notification of export restrictive measures, including improving compliance with existing notification requirements. So, what happens there is that if there is a critical shortage of food grains in the country, and which are essential for a country like India, so obviously India has concerns with making notification requirements because this will become very burdensome for developing country members in view of the sensitivities regarding shortages, price escalations, and the implications of providing advance notice of such measures on the effectiveness of policies. Again, with reference to the contributions to WFP, India has contributed significantly to WFP over the years and has not actually imposed any export restrictions for WFP procurement, but at the same time has extended support to our neighbors, like you mentioned, with food supplies. So, blanket exemptions for the WFP is a concern for India in view of our domestic food security. And one last issue in agriculture is that relating to market access, a special safeguard mechanism for developing countries to protect the domestic agriculture producers against import surges and sudden price falls through additional import duties on the lines of a similar safeguard presently available to many developed and a few developing countries. So, this is the sum total of the issues at stake for India.
Ambassador Vadva, we also see that the WTO reform is something we have been discussing for a while. And we've also seen that many of the global institutions, one hears a lot of discussion about the need for reform in them. But we also see that the world seems to be very slow in changing and accepting the fact that reforms are needed. And the WTO reform is necessary in keeping development at its core with consensus based decision making. And this is a statement that India has put forward. Also, India has strongly said that WTO shouldn't negotiate rules on non trade related subjects. And the minister also mentioned this, adding that non-trade areas such as climate change, gender fall within domain of other intergovernment organizations. The debate always is how realistically, how practically can we expect these reforms to actually move forward and for these statements then to translate into action.
Yes, I think you touched upon a very important point there because on the reform front, India believes that the WTO reform discussions must focus on strengthening its fundamental principles and preserving the special and differentiated treatment, SNDT as we call it, including consensus based decision making, non discrimination, special and differential treatment at this juncture, and should neither result in preserving inherited inequities nor should they worsen the imbalances. So that's where we start from. And amongst the reform proposals, the most consequential, of course, is the US EU Japan trilateral initiative. This was announced at the Ministerial 11, and India has led the initiative to prevent a developing country reform proposal because the developing countries reform paper was called Strengthening the WTO to Promote Development and Inclusivity. This was proposed in August of 2019. And at that time, countries like Bolivia, Cuba, South Africa, Tunisia, Zimbabwe, and Oman, they had all become co-sponsors. Now, this proposal, this paper has been revised a number of times, with the latest one was submitted in February 2022, so that, the reform discussion agenda could be kept alive. And in November 2021, India took the lead to question the proposal from the European Union and Brazil, both on the process and as well as on its objectives, because India did not favor an open-ended exercise on WTO reform without first actually agreeing on the elements of the reform package because of the extraneous issues that you mentioned which were being brought in. So it was proposed by us that the members first need to agree on the elements of the reform package, precise nature of the process to be adopted to carry out the discussions before the ministers can agree to the green light to WTO reform work. Because India believes that the reform process and its outcomes should not alter or affect the members' rights and obligations under the WTO agreements and agreed mandates, and that the agreed rules of procedure of the General Council shall apply also to the review process. So this is being sought to be altered by the developed countries. And one major issue which has been in the limelight recently is the WTO's response to the pandemic, because that's one of the priority items for this ministerial, and that includes the TRIPS waiver proposal, because it's very important given the necessity of producing COVID vaccines across the board in a number of countries, given the crisis that the world is facing. So also one other development was that in June of 2021, there was a facilitator-led process with Ambassador Walker of New Zealand. He was appointed as a facilitator, and he looked at 6 verticals: export restrictions, trade facilitation, regulatory coherence and cooperation in tariffs, and the role of services, transparency in monitoring, and collaboration with other organizations, and the framework to respond more effectively to future pandemics. Now, India has been always engaged with other members and groups to build a consensus for a balanced outcome on all these elements, which Master Walker undertook, because India has concerns on additional permanent disciplines in the WTO agreements to respond to the pandemic. And, we don't want to conflate the challenges of pandemic to areas like market access, to reforms, to export restrictions and transparency. And also India wants that the WTO response need to address the supply side constraints for the WTO's response for the pandemic and the outcomes to be credible. The last issue, which I also like to touch upon here in this context, is on intellectual property, where India is actually seeking a recognition of the difficulties faced by developing countries and least developed countries in utilizing the TRIPS flexibilities to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And secondly, a reaffirmation of the TRIPS waiver decision under the responses declaration. This will then allow vaccines to be produced much more liberally in all countries.
Ambassador Vadva, we also see that at the WTO conference, the Director General has also expressed very cautious optimism, and she also pointed out that the world has become increasingly more complex. And she also listed the lingering COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and major food and energy crisis as pieces of a polycrisis. How do you see this, what she has called a polycrisis, then affecting the world, and how effectively do you think that the WTO can meet this polycrisis as she has put forward?
So she has actually come up with 3 very important drafts for negotiations. And what she said very clearly is that, look, it's not just trade-related issues that the world faces today. We also have the Ukraine issue, which is actually casting a shadow on the negotiations as a whole, because the developed countries, in particular the United States and the EU, want to keep Russia out of the negotiations. Of course, it's a tall order to do that, because Russia controls 2.7% of the world economy today. And keeping Russia out, which is a major commodity producer, exporter, etc., that is not going to really work to have a broad-based, consensus-based agreement on these issues. So that's what she was referring to. And she said that along with that, we have also the issue of this TRIPS waiver for vaccines, because the pandemic is another issue which has not gone away. They're still facing us. And plus, of course, you have a rising inflation. Food prices have risen all over the world. So it's not just a regular ministerial any longer. And that's what she refers to as the polycrisis, which the countries will have to look at. Of course, the other areas that we've discussed already, like fisheries and agriculture, etc., these are ongoing issues. But today, the world faces some new issues which will all affect how we negotiate these issues and how we move forward on them.
And in the coming days, we will continue our discussions on the 12th Ministerial Conference, which is ongoing. And we will also continue our discussions on how the world has changed and how the global developments also affect the negotiations and the workings of the WTO. With these comments, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on 12th World Trade Organization Ministerial Meeting and Stakes for India. The participants were Anil Vadva, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.